This is the Made for Living Well podcast, hosted by Alexa Sherm, the place to create a life well lived.
Welcome back to the podcast. I am so excited to be here. And honestly, I didn't know how much I was going to love talking about bad diet advice and really shifting the story of it, but I have really liked it. And I think it's because it's brought to light a new way to look at it. And probably what makes me more excited than anything in life is really just changing our view of the things we're trying to accomplish or the way we're going about it. Really, it's to create a paradigm shift. And I think that's so important in the world of health because clearly the way we're going about health is not working. And so I hope you're learning just as much as I'm having fun with this. Today, we are in part 3 of bad diet advice. We're actually talking about a subject that doesn't get a lot of conversation in the health space, and that is forgiveness. Now, I know it's not sexy, and you might be like, how in the world is she going to relate this back to bad diet advice? I actually kind of want to call this one good diet advice. And that is the act of forgiving is actually a really great health practice that I think we all should take more seriously. So we're going to talk about forgiveness, but I do want to relate it back to the previous 2 podcasts on bad diet advice. The first one was, again, not to give it all away, but just identifying that where we stop with bad diet advice is really not the root of bad diet advice. There's something deeper that keeps us coming back for more. And likewise, in part 2, we talked about the generational cycles and beliefs that have been created about our bodies, about health and the diet space, and maybe recognizing that some of those beliefs were not our beliefs, but they were just formulated based on culture and history and the people that we spent the most time with. Like some of the things you believe about yourself and your body are untrue, and they have no place and are no help in the scope of getting healthy. And that brings us to part 3, which is forgiving yourself and forgiving other people for the things that they placed on you that maybe weren't true. And even if they were true, the things that you no longer need to hold on to. Because there truly is a weight to forgiveness, and it is impacting your biology. In fact, it has profound impacts on your biology. And today I'm going to break all of that down inside this podcast on really clarifying and identifying what true forgiveness is. And I say all of this knowing that there is a whole level of stubbornness that can come with talking about such a topic as forgiveness. I was one of them who really had a lot of thoughts on forgiveness, and what I thought it was really not what it is at all. So I am going to talk about what forgiveness is and what it's not, and how it relates back to your biology. And then we're going to talk about how do you actually do this. Now, of course, you can get more information on today's show over at thelivingwell.com. I'm specifically going to talk over there about the process of forgiving yourself, which is arguably the hardest thing to forgive, or the hardest person to forgive is yourself. So we're going to break more of that down over in the show notes at thelivingwell.com. Now, I do want to just start this and just say, again, this is not sexy diet advice, right? Like this is not your average, here's how to get healthy. It's not talking about food. It has nothing to do with your exercise routine. It really has nothing to do with what you think health is about, and yet it has everything to do with your health. And I promise I'm going to link this back to your biology because there actually is quite a bit of research stating and showing what a lack of forgiveness or unforgiveness, or maybe even holding on to hurts and pains and trauma is doing inside of our body, and it's having profound impacts. So I just want to go back and state that while you might not have heard this link to health in the past, I really think sometimes it's these things that we don't think about that are going to create the greatest change in our lives. It's the off-the-wall ideas, the things that maybe you've overlooked because you've really attempted health in all of the right ways before, and maybe they're not working, not because they're not actually working, but because there's something more, something deeper that's keeping you stuck. And oftentimes that comes back to a place of unforgiveness. Now, just to start the podcast, I do find that it's really important to identify and to define what these words are. Words and word structure and history of words really is refreshing work for me because I think sometimes what we believed about things isn't actually the intent or the root of the word. And if we can go back and understand the root, then we can understand the language and the reasons and the why so much better. And I have to do this for myself because what I've believed about a lot of things isn't true and it's not helpful. And if I stay stuck in these places, I'm really never going to experience the fullness of life and the wholeness that's required in order to get healthy. And forgiveness was one of these terms that was really twisted inside my mind. Honestly, I understood it, not necessarily based on health, but just something that I had to do. I kind of really believed that forgiveness was kind of letting the other person off the hook. Like it was kind of just like an act of dismissal about the pain that was caused. And truthfully, that's not what forgiveness is at all. In fact, I just want to start this podcast and tell you, forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not denying the hurt. It's not the same as reconciliation. You can forgive, but you do not always need to reconcile. It's not circumventing God's justice. It's not excusing the wrong behavior. It's not letting the guilt off the hook. It's not explaining away the hurt. It's not shoving your anger, and it's not stuffing it in places where you just have to hold on to it. And forgiveness is not a feeling. Now, if you're like me, you probably need to stop this podcast, just rewind a little bit and listen to that again. Because it's really, really, really important that we have a better view of what forgiveness is. And I want to start by just clearing the air and saying, this is what it's not. And when you can let go of the things that you thought forgiveness was, then you can open up to see, okay, but then what is it? And forgiveness truly is, it's a letting go. It's a release. And the dictionary defines it as a conscious decision to let go of negative feelings, such as anger, resentment, and hostility, all to lead to a greater sense of wholeness. And interestingly, wholeness is the root word of health. Health is achieving or coming to a place of wholeness. So if you put that together, what that really means is that forgiveness is required to fully heal. It's a part of the process. It has to be part of the act of getting well. And the thing about forgiveness is, like most things, it's not an arrival. You won't just automatically get to a place where you've forgiven everyone. It's a process. Sometimes it takes work, but also things and people and even yourself are always going to hurt you from time to time. Like forgiveness doesn't end, but it's rather a way of life. It's part of your life, another rhythm or discipline that you enact. And I think when you can come to a better place of understanding what forgiveness is, there's a lot more motivation to make it part of your life. When you recognize what it's not dismissing or excusing away what's been done. It's not denying or forgetting, but it's really a way for you to create more wholeness in your life. And I love this idea of forgiveness from the book, Forgiveness, A Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart. The author states, your concept of forgiveness can either hinder you and limit your capacity for clarity and joy, or it can uplift you, giving you a way to release the past and be free to live with greater peace and happiness. I read that book. I think it's a fantastic book on forgiveness. It definitely altered my view of it. And it really helped to make sense of how is this having a biological impact on my body? Now, as forgiveness relates back to bad diet advice, why I think forgiveness stands in that topic. Like last week, we learned there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen in the health space, and there's an equal amount of untangling that has to happen. I think when we look at a lot of our lives that we're living tangled in this web of hurts and pains and stored memories that are actually taking a lot of energy. They're taking a lot of things away from our biology and our ability to thrive. And I think that's really what's so unhealthy about unforgiveness is the way that it continuously hurts you. And I don't think we always see this. This was something that really created a powerful shift in my desire to forgive, was recognizing all of the ways that it was actually just hurting me. all of the ways my life was consumed and circled around these old traumas and these old pains that I refused to let go. And if you understand the cycle of unforgiveness, which I have a whole visual that I'll put up in the show notes, it really shows that unforgiveness is taking hurt and it creates memories and it gives it attention and energy that it becomes kind of part of your life, right? Like those things that have been done to you. And in the process of that, you might try to shove it or push it off, but it's always there. It's always rearing its ugly head. And then when you're triggered or another life action happens, sometimes it can trigger that memory to resurface, which repeats the process of you investing energy back into it, you feeling the pain of it, and the cycle just repeats. It's a cycle of pain. Unforgiveness is a cycle of stress and pain and overwhelm, and it truly is a threat to your system. Now, the way out of that is obviously through forgiveness. And again, going back to the biological need of this, what we have to understand is your body will always do what's safe. And sometimes, with our poor understanding of what forgiveness is, the safest thing our bodies and minds can conceptualize when it comes to life is just to hold on to things. It's to hold on to the memory as a means to prevent you from going through it again. Or that's the assumption, right? Like, I can remember when someone said this. I remember where I was. I remember what I'm wearing. I can see what could be a trigger. Therefore, I'm going to try and stay away from that as much as possible. That's the power of a stored memory. Technically speaking, it's supposed to help you keep you on the straight and narrow or a more pain-free life. Now, as a human, you're always going to experience pain. It's part of our existence on earth. It's inescapable. What I fear is that we're masters of our own misery. We're self-creating our own pain by refusing to escape what we're choosing to stay stuck in. And what I mean by that is sometimes we're choosing to repeat our pain simply because we refuse the way out, which is the act of forgiveness. Now, again, going back biologically speaking, we can see that this is a really safe place to exist. It's safe to be aware of threats, right? And the more threatened you are, the more you're going to become aware of that to keep yourself alive. Now, of course, that's not what's healthy, but oftentimes what is safe and what are healthy are not necessarily in line with one another because the ultimate job of the body is to keep you alive. But the goal is to thrive. And the only way to move into that state of thriving is to, in some way, create a sense of safety. You do not have to rely on the world or other people to create this for you, but there is an internal sense of safety that can completely override your biology for the better. Like it can change your biology if you can shift your perspective. Now, again, going back to this idea of forgiveness or unforgiveness, how you view life or what you choose to do with forgiveness is ultimately going to alter your biology. Because if we remember from previous discussions about how our biology works and the stress response and the use of energy, we know that everything our body stores and holds onto or has to process is an energy expense. It takes work to do all of this. Like you might think your thoughts are just floating around in space and the emotions you feel are just happening, but they're not. It comes at a price. In some cases, that energy can then be channeled into more positive ways. It can actually uplift you and help you generate more energy. But there are also thoughts that actually disrupt your energy patterns, draining you of it. And you can feel this, right? You can feel the energetic difference between being happy and laughing and alive and feeling sad and threatened and scared and angry and bitter. Like when we look on the scale of emotions, which again, I'll link up in the show notes, there is a drastic energy difference between more of those positive emotions like joy and elation and bitterness, which is extremely energy exhaustive. And in the process of that energy exhaustion, you're starting to signal a stress response. You're saying there's a threat on the horizon, and therefore your body's going to start to shift accordingly. Now, what's fascinating about this work is the genetic component to it. And this is really where we get into how it alters your health response or your biological response that dictates your health. Now, last week we kind of talked about the generational beliefs and conditions that maybe created your beliefs and your conditions and how those might be unhealthy and untrue. In the email from this previous week, I also talked about the genetic difference of some people just want to blame their genetics for their health problems. But what we now know about genetics is that's not necessarily true. Sure, you do inherit your genes from your parents, but how those genes are expressed is really what creates the outcomes you experience. And genetic expression, which is the field and study called epigenetics, actually comes from the environment. Meaning your environment is responsible for what genes are expressed and how those genes live out, or what action your cells create. So yes, there are hereditary understanding of genetics, but more than that, most of the time, and what I really believe is that you don't necessarily inherit disease, but you are a product of an inherited environment, which created the disease. Your life and health might look similar to your parents, not necessarily just because of the genes that you inherited, but because of the expression of those genes, which comes from living in a similar environment. We are a product of patterns. We often repeat patterns unless you become a cycle breaker, which there's not a lot of statistics to say how many people actually break cycles, but in life, it's presumed that few people actually break cycles, more people repeat those cycles, and if you keep repeating those cycles, you're going to live out of similar genetic patterns as your parents. Not necessarily because of what has been inherited internally or genetically, but more so because of the environment that you inherited. And part of that environment is your view of forgiveness, is your view of what you hold on to, is your view of how do you deal with the things that are coming in that maybe hurt you. What are you doing with those things? And biologically speaking, if you're allowing them in and you're allowing them to become a part of your life, if they're a part of your story, if you believe them and you enact them, or even if you go to the other extreme where you try to shove them and stuff them and overrun them, it's still part of your genetic makeup. It's still altering your genetics. Now, a lack of forgiveness often comes from hurt, anger, bitterness, these more negative things or energy exhaustive things. Over time and repeated patterns, these can lead to disease. In fact, research has found that a lack of forgiveness can cause a host of problems, including mindset problems like depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. It can increase your risk of heart attack, hypertension, and premature death. Grudges can hurt your immune system, making the body more susceptible to inflammation and infectious illness. It can increase stress, putting strain on your hormonal system. It can lead to muscle tension and strain and pain. And of course, it has effects on your reproductive system and overall lowering of mortality. That is all research that's been done on the lack of forgiveness. In contrast, and the opposite, forgiveness has the opposite effect. It leads to more wholeness. It leads to health. There is a biological response based on the emotional component of what you experience. And what you choose within that experience is going to drastically alter the outcomes that you create and generate. And I think this information is really powerful because forgiveness really lies in our control. It's another free health tool that we have at our disposal, but we have to choose it. And again, choosing it goes back to understanding it in a little bit of a new way. Understanding that it's not all of the things that I told you forgiveness was not, but rather it's kind of a rebirth. It's a letting go of all the things that have hurt you so that you can create space to fully heal. I love this quote from Stephen Levine. He's an author and teacher who has worked extensively with people with chronic and life-threatening illnesses. And he says, "The process of healing is much more than a change in physical symptoms. Healing occurs in those moments when we let go of fear and allow a deeper peace, when we allow our minds to sink into our hearts and surround our pain with love." It's really just a different way to approach life and a different way to approach health. And what I love so much about this is it's free. There is no cost associated with the act of forgiveness. In fact, it gives you so much. You receive so much from forgiving. And that was a twist in the story that I told myself about forgiveness that I really had to hold on to. Forgiveness, or my lack of forgiveness, was actually hurting me more than anyone else. And as previously mentioned, of course, there are reasons why we choose to hold on to things. We will always hold on to things unless we create a safe enough space in order to free them from our lives. Like, if we are not safe, we'll continuously circulate out of our pain and out of our trauma as a way and a means of survival. But in the process, as you've learned, that is also altering your genetic makeup and the health of your biology. It's changing every single one of your 44 trillion cells. Like, this is a really big deal. And I think in our process of unforgiveness and holding on to things, the amount of energy that we're expending and wasting on something that has only continuously hurt us is astonishing. Like, when you really wrap your mind around the fact that a cycle of unforgiveness is supporting the things that are hurting you more than they're helping you. It's allowing the cycle to repeat itself. Again, it doesn't always have to make sense, and it doesn't always have to be healthy for our body to engage with it. It will first and foremost engage with what's safe. And as long as unforgiveness feels safer to you than the act of forgiveness, you will probably never engage with it. That's why you first have to change your perspective of forgiveness so that you can see the benefit of it. And I had to do this too. Trust me, this has not been easy for me. But in the process of letting go, you really do start to open up space to see life in a new way. Like, you can take a breath when you throw off the hurt and pain other people put on you. You don't have to carry it around. Now, of course, I think that process is probably a little bit easier. At least in my own life, I found it easier to forgive other people than it was to do the work of forgiving myself. And even forgiving my body for what I thought it had done to fail me. And I really just want to end this podcast talking about the power of self-forgiveness. Again, this is not selfish, but if we go back to the understanding of even confidence, the podcast we had a few weeks ago, the more you fear yourself, the more you hate yourself, the more inflated yourself is going to become. So I really want you to see that self-forgiveness is the opposite of selfishness. It's actually more selflessness. It's allowing you to get outside of yourself. Now, this is also really difficult. And I think that we overlook this, and how I want to tie it back into bad diet advice in the previous podcast is being willing to forgive yourself and to forgive the people who put other thoughts and beliefs on you about yourself and about the health space that weren't true. Like, at some point, we can't just acknowledge that what we've learned maybe isn't truthful, or what we believed about our body isn't truthful. We also have to forgive ourselves for believing those things and speaking those lies over ourselves as truth. And what I mean by this is, like, at some point, we have to start forgiving ourselves, having the awareness and understanding to acknowledge the things that we're saying about ourselves, the things that we believe about ourselves, and then have the compassion and grace to say, I don't need to believe those, and I'm going to forgive myself for the things that I spoke over them. To really see that some of the things that you say about yourself and some of the beliefs that you have are really creating a lot of pain inside your life. They're making you a master of your own misery. I'm just going to throw out some words about your body, and I want you to think about the first thing that comes to your mind, or write down the first thing that comes to mind. Like, what happens when I say cellulite, or body fat, or your thighs? Or what do you think about when you think about your stomach or your hair? In most cases, there's probably some not so great self-talk happening in there, right? Like, in some way, you're probably allowing some hurtful things to run through your mind, even when we speak of those things. Again, not all of these are your beliefs, but these were instilled upon you, maybe by other people, or by things that you picked up by just watching culture and being immersed in the world. We really have created unattainable expectations that few people will ever meet in the world of health and what it means to live and look healthy. And I think as long as we hold ourselves to those standards, it's going to be really difficult to ever allow yourself to be free of the thoughts and negativity that surrounds those things. And part of the way out is just learning how to forgive yourself. And in the act of forgiving yourself, you'll find that you become a lot more kind to yourself. You'll have more compassion and grace and understanding. Not as a means to be complacent, but I think this is the power and the level of the greatest change. When you can get into the space of just being honest with yourself, about recognizing that the human nature is not always to like everything about yourself. If you don't like everything, that just means you're human. But in the process of that, you can still love yourself well. You can still release some of those ideas and thoughts that you have, knowing that talking badly about yourself is really never going to help you get healthy. It's never going to help you exist in the space in the way that you want to. It's always going to hold you back. It's the same way for blaming your body. Like you can blame it for the way that it's failed you or for the way that it hasn't lost fat, or you can blame your genetics and all of these things, but the blame game is really only shifting away from the place of guilt and shame that really feels too much to carry yourself. So you shift that to other things. Again, neither of it is healthy or helpful. It really is only holding you back. What you have to do is you have to get to the place of recognizing the places that maybe you haven't always been kind to yourself. Maybe you're currently not being kind to yourself. Not to say that it's going to go away immediately. There's a process to this, but just acknowledging that the way and the things that you're telling yourself and you're holding on to and the beliefs that you believed, even if they're not true, are definitely not helpful, and they are altering your biology. But when you can slowly begin the process of forgiving and really creating the posture of forgiveness as a part of your daily life, you can start to create space by throwing off the things that are hurting you and holding you back. And really, that is the power of forgiveness. It creates more wholeness because forgiveness helps untangle the things that are keeping you stuck. It helps untie the ropes that are holding you back so that you can go out and live your God-given purpose. And even when we talk about forgiveness, we can't neglect that this is a very spiritual aspect, right? Like one of God's greatest commands to us was to forgive. And I think sometimes we can look at that as like another chore or another law or another rule, when really maybe this was one of God's greatest gifts to us, was the command and the discipline of forgiveness, not as a means to hurt us, but actually to help us live more whole and fulfilling lives, to help us live more whole. It's a shift in perspective, but I hope you're starting to see that this has immense power. And no, it is anything but sexy. I know you would rather me tell you about all the things you should be eating and everything else, right? But even when we look at food rules, some of us need to just forgive ourselves for the way that we put a moral code on food, for the way we make ourselves feel bad for the different things that we eat. That is not helpful. It is not helping anything. In fact, it is still changing your biology. And I wonder sometimes if this is the very reason why so few people can change even though they're doing all of the right things. It's because they're stuck in the weight and the heaviness and the overwhelm and the stress of holding on to so many things that are just not worth what they're bringing. I know I still have things I need to let go of. This is not easy work. But it does simplify the process, as you can see, as you start to throw off those things, as you start to forgive, you start to free yourself from holding on to those things. And it opened up space to give you more energy. So I like to think of the act of forgiveness like the snowball effect. Anything that you can do to let go of the things that are stealing your energy, it's going to be hard at first. But the more you do it, the easier it becomes, because the more energy you're going to snowball into, and the more energy you have, the more energy you have available to deal with these things. See, sometimes we like to go to the deepest places of healing first, and that's really not possible without the nourishment and safety to get there. So in the process of forgiving, you might just need to start on the surface. You might need to start with what's easy. And sometimes what's easy is just looking at the daily little things. It's when the person cuts you off in traffic, instead of stewing on that and being mad about it all day, just be like, okay, like I'm going to have a little compassion that they must be going through some things. I'm not going to hold on to it. Or maybe the way your boss explodes to you today. it's probably not really that much about you, but it's about situations that are happening in their own life. I am going to choose to acknowledge that, but also to release that. I don't need to hold on to that. It might be choosing to forgive your spouse for not listening when you told them something important. Again, it's rarely about you, but it's often about people living in their own trauma and their own pain and their own stories and their own stress. But then it might also mean when you look at yourself in the mirror and you recognize that you said something hurtful, it's to say like, I'm sorry for saying these things about my body. I'm sorry, body, for the way that I've put you down. I'm sorry for thinking negatively about you. I'm sorry for blaming you all the time. It's really little ways of affirmations, of just acknowledging and forgiving. In the process of that, you'll start to release bigger and bigger things and really start to experience the freedom of that. Now, I know I didn't do the topic of forgiveness justice in these 30 minutes. This could be an entire series. I'm going to link up some more resources that will be beneficial to you, but I really also encourage you to head to the show notes where I show you the cycle of unforgiveness and the cycle of forgiveness. And there really is drastic power in your energy change and the way that influences your cells. And if you can influence yourselves in a positive way, you will live in a healthier way. Like it is a product of change. And what I love about this is it doesn't require some crazy strenuous diet or exercise plan. Like I think sometimes we miss health because we miss all of these things, these little things that we think are little that are actually massive, and the power and the ability it has to create change in your own life. So make sure you head on over to thelivingwell.com to learn more about forgiveness and some of my favorite resources that have helped me alter my view of forgiveness and really to own it in a new way. And of course, don't forget to go back and listen to the previous podcast on bad diet advice, which really this podcast should probably be labeled good diet advice, which comes in the form of forgiveness. Now, I've had a lot of fun with these last 3 podcasts, and I'm kind of like, how can we go deeper here or learn a little bit more? But I want to know, what are you loving? What do you need help with? What do you want to hear more about? I would love it if you sent me an email at alexa@thelivingwell.com and let me know what you would like to hear more about, what you're learning, and what you really do want to learn. I'm in the process of working through the next series in the podcast, which I think is going to be all about metabolism and energy and really boosting that part of you. But I would love to hear from you first and foremost. Now, as always, if you want to learn more, you can learn more about this process, how to actually forgive, inside my course, Health Made Simple. Literally, it is an 8-module class that takes you through the very process of creating a new path in health. And forgiveness is inside this course, including an entire section inside the work on how to change your view of yourself and lean into the process of self-forgiveness. You can learn more about Health Made Simple at thelivingwell.com. Okay, that's it for today. Next week, we have a very special interview on the podcast talking similar about forgiveness as we start talking about neuronutrition, how nutrition influences your brain. Okay, that's it, and I'll see you back here next week.